The little girl's hair was the first thing people noticed, not her father's steady hands or the way he knelt beside her in the morning before school, tongue caught between his teeth, working the sections apart with the slow patience of someone who understood that this mattered. Not the comb he carried in the chest pocket of his work jacket or the small bottle of oil he kept in the bathroom cabinet beside his razor. What people noticed was the result. Two clean, even plaits crossing back from her temples, fastened with the same yellow bands she had picked out herself from the drugstore display, the ends smooth and lying flat. Every morning, without fail, for 3 years. What Marcus did not know was that one of those mornings was about to cost him something he had never expected, and then give him back something he had not known was gone. His daughter Zoe was 7 years old that October, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. She also had her mother's hair, thick and soft and prone to frizzing at the crown when the humidity climbed, which meant Marcus had learned things about moisture and porosity and the difference between a rat-tail comb and a wide tooth that he could not have named 2 years before. He had not planned to learn them. He had simply looked at his daughter one morning 3 years ago, 9 months after the funeral, and understood that no one else was going to do it. Zoe's grandmother lived 40 minutes away and worked double shifts at the hospital laundry. Her aunt was in Atlanta. The woman from church who had brought casseroles in the weeks after the accident had her own 4 children and her own mornings to manage. Marcus was it. He was the one who stood in the kitchen at 6:55 in the morning with a spray bottle and a comb, and a daughter who squirmed and asked questions and once, in the early weeks, cried because he pulled too hard on a knot, and he had stood there frozen, hands still in her hair, not knowing whether to apologize for the pain or for all of it. All of it, the whole broken year that had landed the two of them in this kitchen without her. He apologized for the pull. He learned to be gentler. He learned to detangle from the ends up. He learned what the yellow bands meant to her, that they were the ones her mother had bought the last time she had taken Zoe to the beauty supply store on a Saturday, 7 months before the accident, and that as long as those yellow bands were in the bag in the bathroom cabinet, there was something still tethered, something that had not been lost. He bought new yellow bands when the supply ran low. He matched them exactly. If you think you know what this story is, hold on. You only know part of it yet. He had been doing her hair for 3 years when Zoe's second-grade teacher, a brisk woman named Mrs. Calloway, who did not waste words, stopped him one afternoon in the pickup line and said that Zoe talked about her hair-doing time constantly, that she had told the class during sharing that her daddy braided better than anyone she had ever seen, and that Mrs. Calloway was inclined to believe her. Marcus had thanked her and buckled Zoe into the back seat and did not say anything for the length of 2 traffic lights. Then he said, "You told your class about that?" And Zoe said, yes, like it was obvious, and he had looked at her in the rearview mirror and felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a word for yet. He worked in facilities management at a mid-sized office building downtown, which meant he spent his days doing the things that kept a building standing and functioning without anyone noticing. He fixed what broke. He maintained what hadn't broken yet. A broken HVAC on the 14th floor, a leaking pipe in the second-floor men's room, a set of lobby doors whose sensors had gone temperamental in cold weather. He handled all of it with the quiet thoroughness of someone who found satisfaction in the work itself and did not need anyone to watch. He was good at it, and his supervisor, a man named Earl who had worked with him for 6 years, trusted him completely, which was the kind of trust that is proven over time and does not require a lot of words. The job was not the kind that left a man feeling seen. He checked in at 7:30, wore a grey uniform with his name on a patch above the left pocket, moved through hallways where the people who occupied them did not know his name, did not know what he spent his evenings studying on his phone, did not know what he carried in his chest pocket, or what his mornings looked like before any of those office lights came on. He was invisible in the particular way that working men are invisible in buildings they maintain, present in the infrastructure and absent from the attention, and he had made his peace with it. He had other things to think about. The comb in his pocket was proof of that. He had bought it specifically because it fit flat in a chest pocket without printing against the fabric, which was the kind of problem he had not previously had occasion to solve. He took Zoe to get her ends trimmed the first Saturday in November. It was a small salon 4 blocks from their apartment, the kind with old magazines on a side table and a fish tank by the door, and a woman named Diane who had been cutting hair at the same station for 16 years. Diane was the one who had trimmed Zoe's ends since she was 4, first with her mother, and then, After, with Marcus standing nearby, holding Zoe's jacket and her backpack and watching carefully so he would know what to do. He had watched Diane work with the attention he gave to anything he needed to understand, noticing how she moved through the steps without hesitation, what products she reached for first, how she held her scissors when she worked close to the scalp. In the early visits, he had brought the small, spiral-bound notebook he used for work orders and written down what he observed, the names of the products, the order of the steps, the way certain sections were handled differently from others. Diane had looked at the notebook once and not said anything, which he took as permission to keep using it. She did her work and talked to Zoe about school and sometimes glanced at Marcus with an expression he could not fully read, but that did not make him uncomfortable. That first Saturday in November, Diane was not in. There was a sign on her station that said she was out for a family matter and would return in 2 weeks. The woman who met them at the door was new to the salon. Her name tag said Renee, and she was in her mid-30s with natural hair pulled up high and hands that moved with the authority of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. She looked at Zoe, and then at Marcus, and then at Zoe's hair, and her expression shifted in a way that was not unkind, but was clearly assessing. "Just a trim," Marcus said. "Half an inch, maybe. Diane usually does it." Renee said Diane would be back in 2 weeks if he wanted to wait. Marcus said Zoe had a school picture on the 12th, and he had promised her she would be fresh for it. Renee pulled on her gloves and told them to come on back. She unwound the plaits carefully, and Marcus watched her do it, noting the technique without meaning to, the way she kept her wrists loose and worked from the bottom up, the same way he had learned. Renee washed Zoe's hair and conditioned it and combed it through under the water and wrapped her in a towel. And then she sat Zoe at the station and took a long look at the length and the ends and the shape of the hair overall. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus in the mirror. "Who does her hair?" Marcus said. "I do." Renee was quiet again. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more like she was placing something. "Every day? Every day," he said. She turned back to the mirror and to Zoe's hair, and she was still for another beat, and then she picked up her scissors and began to work. A few minutes later she stopped again and set the scissors down and looked at him in the mirror, and the expression on her face had changed. It was not assessing anymore. "Who taught you?" she said. Marcus looked at the fish tank by the door for a moment, then back at her. "I taught myself," he said. "YouTube, mostly, and trial and error." He paused. "And Zoe telling me when I got it wrong." Zoe, who had been watching their conversation in the mirror with the solemn attentiveness of a 7-year-old who understands she is the subject, said helpfully, "He pulled too hard once, but that was a long time ago." Renee smiled at Zoe in the mirror, and it was a full smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. Then she looked at Marcus again, and there was something in that look that made him feel, briefly and without explanation, that she was seeing something he had not meant to show. "You've been doing this how long?" she said. 3 years, he said. She nodded once, like that confirmed something, and picked up her scissors again. She worked the rest of the trim in a focused quiet, hands precise, snipping the ends clean and even, and Marcus sat in the waiting chair and watched and said nothing. He was used to waiting. He had gotten very good at waiting, at the still patience of someone who had learned that being present was sometimes the whole of what was needed. What he did not know then was that Renee had been watching him for the length of that appointment in the way that someone watches a thing that does not quite fit the frame they already have, and that she was going to go home that evening and think about what she had seen, and that it was going to matter. He paid for the trim and helped Zoe with her jacket and held the door for the older woman coming in behind them, and he and Zoe walked the 4 blocks home through the November cold, Zoe holding his hand and telling him at length about something that had happened at recess involving a ball and a fence, and a misunderstanding that she felt had been incorrectly adjudicated. He listened. He always listened. He made a comment at the end that made her laugh, and she squeezed his hand, and by the time they got to their building she had moved on to asking what was for dinner, and Marcus said he was thinking soup, and she said she wanted the kind with the little pasta shapes, and he said he would see what he could do. He did her hair Sunday evening for the week ahead, which was his practice, sitting her in the kitchen chair with her chosen show on the tablet on the counter and working while she watched. The room warm and smelling of the oil he heated slightly before use, and she was still enough that he could work cleanly, both of them in the particular piece of a thing they had done so many times it no longer needed explaining. He had learned over the 3 years to read the texture of her hair, the way he read other things in his work. by feel and by the small signals a material gives you when you know how to listen for them. When it was thirsty, he could tell before the spray bottle. When it was going to need extra time at the crown, he knew before he started. He could do the plaits in 12 minutes now, on a good day, and not because he had gotten careless, but because his hands had finally learned the work and stopped fighting it. He put her to bed at 8:30 and cleaned up the kitchen and sat at the table with the bills he had been putting off and paid the ones he could and left the ones he couldn't in a separate pile. The furnace had been making a sound he did not like, and he had not had it serviced yet. Zoe needed new shoes, the kind she had been asking for that were more than he had. The rent had gone up $30 in September. He did the math the same way he always did, slowly and honestly and without dramatics. And what the math said was what it had been saying for a while, which was that he was holding on, that the margin was thin, that one broken thing could change the picture significantly. He put the bills back in the folder and turned off the kitchen light and went and checked on Zoe, who was already deep under the covers with one arm flung out and her breathing slow and even. And he stood in the doorway for a moment the way he did most nights, not for any particular reason, except that this was the way the day ended, and the day ending was enough. He was behind the school on the 12th, waiting in the pickup line, when his phone showed a number he didn't recognize. He let it go. It rang again 20 minutes later, same number, and he picked it up this time, and a woman said she was trying to reach Marcus Webb, and he said that was him. And she said her name was Renee and that she had done his daughter's trim the previous Saturday at Diane's salon. He remembered her immediately. He said, "I remember, yes." She asked if he had a minute, and he said he was in a pickup line, but go ahead. There was a brief pause on her end, and then she said she wanted to explain why she was calling. And she wanted him to hear her out before he said anything, because she understood it might sound like an odd call to receive from a stylist who had met him once. He said, "Okay." She told him she had a studio. Not where she worked now, her own space, a room she rented in a shared building on Clement Street, where she took clients on weekends and 2 evenings a week. She had been building it for 2 years, and she had a regular book. Nothing enormous, but steady. She said she had a client who had been asking her for months to teach her husband to do their daughter's hair, the way she had seen other stylists do on video, and that she had been hesitant because she had tried it once with someone else, and it had not gone the way she hoped, and she had not wanted to take it on again. She said she had been thinking since Saturday about what she had seen with Marcus, about the fact that he had taught himself on his own, that his daughter's hair showed real care and real skill, that the plaits she had undone before the trim were clean and even and done by someone who paid attention. She said she thought he might be exactly the kind of person who could help her build something she had been thinking about for a while. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I want to offer you a job. Part-time, evenings, starting small, teaching. I have 7 clients in the last 2 months who have asked me about a class or a workshop for dads, and I have been saying I was not ready, and I think maybe I have been waiting for the right person to say yes." Marcus sat in the pickup line. Through the windshield he could see the school doors opening and the stream of children starting to emerge, backpacks bouncing, the same chaos of every afternoon. He said, "I'm a facilities man. I maintain office buildings." Renee said she understood that. She said that was not what she was asking him to be. She said she was asking him if he would be willing to come to her studio on a Saturday morning and sit across from 4 or 5 men who were in the same situation he had been in 3 years ago and show them what he knew, that the work was real, that it was possible, that it was not as far away as it looked from where they were standing. She named a figure for the first session. It was not a large figure, but it was not nothing either. And in the context of the bills in the folder on the kitchen table, it was a specific and real number. He told her he would think about it. She said that was fine and gave him her number and said it did not have to be this week, that she was not going anywhere. He thought about it for 4 days. He thought about it while he replaced a failing breaker in the building's 3rd-floor utility room, crouched in the small utility space with his flashlight and his hands doing the work automatically, while his mind ran the question back and forth. He thought about it while he ate lunch alone in the facilities office with the door pulled mostly shut, which was the closest thing to privacy the job offered. He thought about it on Wednesday evening while he was doing Zoe's hair for Thursday, working the sections at the kitchen table, and Zoe was watching her show and he was only half there, turning the question over. She noticed the way she always noticed when he was only half present, and she turned and looked at him and said, "What are you thinking about?" And he said, "Something someone asked me to do." And she looked at him for a moment and said, "Is it a good thing?" And he said he thought it might be, and she said, "Then you should probably do it. with the clean certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be afraid of trying. And then she turned back to her show. He thought about it while he walked her to school on Thursday morning, her 2 fresh plaits catching the pale November light, and she held his hand and talked about something that had happened at lunch. And he listened, and above them the cold sky was clear and very blue, and the question was still running, but it was running quieter now, settling toward an answer. He thought about what Renee had seen in him that he had not thought to see in himself, that the thing he had built quietly in a kitchen over 3 years, the slow, patient knowledge of it, might be something another man needed and could not find on his own. He thought about the men who were somewhere right now, standing in their kitchens, pulling too hard on a knot, not knowing about detangling from the bottom up, not knowing what the yellow bands meant, not knowing that the missing was a room you learned to carry, rather than one you learned to leave. He thought about the fact that no one had taught him, and what it would have cost him and cost Zoe if he had decided it was not his to learn. He called Renee on Thursday evening after Zoe was in bed. He said he would do the first session. He said he needed to know whether the clients would be bringing their daughters. Renee said some would and some wouldn't, depending on what they had arranged, but that she recommended it, that it helped to have a child in the room. He said that made sense to him. He said he would bring Zoe if she was willing. Renee said she thought that would be the right thing to do. Zoe, when he asked her on Friday evening, said yes without hesitating, in the immediate way she had, and then asked what she was agreeing to exactly. He explained it to her, sitting at the kitchen table, and she listened with her head tilted in the way she did, and then said, "So other dads need to learn?" And Marcus said yes, some of them did. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "We can teach them," with a confidence that was simply matter of fact, as if there were no doubt about it. And Marcus looked at her and felt the thing in his chest move again, the thing he had not had a word for, and he thought he was starting to find one. He prepared differently than he had for anything in a long time. He did not know how to teach, had never thought of himself as someone who taught. He understood preparation, and he understood that the men who would come to Renee's studio on that Saturday morning would be there because they were afraid of getting it wrong, which was the same reason he had gone to the YouTube videos 3 years ago. And so he thought about what he had needed then, not instructions, but permission, someone who looked like what he was going through and had come out the other side holding something. He wrote out the steps he now did by feel, translating the knowledge in his hands back into words, which was harder than he expected. He practiced on Zoe twice that week, slow and narrated, saying out loud what he was doing and why, and she listened and corrected him once when he described the section parting wrong, and he thanked her and wrote it down correctly. There were 6 men in Renee's studio that Saturday morning. They ranged in age from mid-20s to mid-50s. 3 had daughters with them, small girls who sat in chairs along the wall and watched the adults with expressions that varied from bored to intensely curious. 2 of the men were in work clothes, as if they had come directly from an early shift, and one was in a suit jacket over a t-shirt, which was the combination of a man who had planned to dress up and then reconsidered halfway through. All 6 had the look of people who had driven somewhere unfamiliar and were not entirely sure they had the right address. The studio was a clean, warm room, with good light and 2 salon chairs and a counter with supplies laid out in an order that was clearly deliberate. The combs by size, the bottles labelled, the practice stands positioned, so each man would have his own space without crowding his neighbour. Renee had thought the room through. She had understood what the men would need before they knew they needed it. She introduced Marcus simply, just his name and the fact that he was a single father who had been doing his daughter's hair for 3 years and had agreed to share what he knew, and she said it in the tone of someone stating a credential that was sufficient, that did not need amplification. Marcus stood up and for a moment looked at the 6 men looking back at him and felt the full weight of the room, which was not just 6 men but everything 6 men were carrying when they showed up on a Saturday morning to learn what they had not known how to ask for. He recognized the weight because he had been carrying the same thing once, and he knew its exact dimensions. He started with what he wished someone had told him first. He started with the bottom-up rule and why it mattered, and with the fact that the first dozen times it would feel wrong and the hair would seem like it was fighting you, and it was not fighting you, it was just telling you what it needed, and that was different, and learning to tell the difference was most of the work. He talked about moisture, and he talked about patience, and he talked about what it meant to do the same thing every day, not because it was required, but because the person you were doing it for needed to know you were going to show up and keep showing up, and that there was something in the repetition itself, in the daily faithful doing of the thing, that said something words were not big enough to say. He did not plan to say that. He said it because it was true and because the room needed it to be said. And when he said it, the man in the second chair, mid-30s, big hands, wedding rings still on his left hand, looked at the floor and nodded once, slow, and Marcus did not look away from him when he nodded. The daughters came forward when it was time to practice. Zoe sat in the main salon chair and let Marcus work through the first demonstrations slowly, talking the steps aloud, showing the grip and the tension and the way the comb moved. The other girls drifted over by their fathers, the studio filled with the particular sounds of men learning a careful and unfamiliar thing, the slow drag of a comb, a murmured question, Renee moving among them quiet and precise, correcting a wrist angle here, guiding a section there. One of the girls, maybe 5 years old, told her father he was doing it wrong with the frank authority of someone who had been watching this done correctly her whole life. And the room laughed, and the laughter was warm and not unkind, and it broke something open that had been held too tightly. At the end of the session, the man with the wedding ring still on his left hand came to Marcus and stood for a moment before saying anything. He had his daughter up on his hip, 5 years old, one uneven pigtail that he had done himself that morning, the band slightly loose, the part not quite straight but there and finished, which was a beginning. He had done it. He had tried and gotten it most of the way there, and his daughter had let him, which was its own kind of thing. He said, "My wife died in April." He said it the way you say a true thing when you've been saying it long enough that it no longer destroys you every time. But it still costs something, a quarter's worth of something, a small specific amount that comes out of the same account every time you say it, and the account does not quite replenish overnight. He said his daughter would not let anyone else touch her hair. He said she had been sleeping in her mother's t-shirts and she would not get rid of any of them. And she was 5 years old and she was managing things in her 5-year-old way. And the least he could do was handle the one thing she let him handle. He said he had been making a mess of it for 7 months and feeling like a failure every morning. Marcus looked at the man and at his daughter and at the uneven pigtail, which was a real thing the man had done with his own hands that morning, in a room where no one had told him how, and he said, "You're already past the hardest part." The man looked at him. "You already know it matters," Marcus said. "That took me a while to understand. Once you know it matters, the rest of it you can learn." The man's daughter was looking at Marcus from her father's hip with her mother's seriousness in her face. 5 years old, taking him in. He held her look for a moment and then looked back at her father. "She let you," Marcus said simply. "That's not nothing." Devon looked at his daughter and then at Marcus, and something in his face shifted, the set of it, the held part of it, and he nodded once, not like he was agreeing to something new, but like he was recognizing something that had been true for a while, and he had just been given permission to call it what it was. Devon signed up for the next 3 sessions before he left the building. Renee filled those sessions within a week, 7 men the second time, and 8 the third, and she and Marcus started talking on the phone about what the thing could grow into, whether there was a way to run a regular class, whether other salons might be interested in hosting, whether there was something in the structure they had found that was worth building more deliberately. She was precise and practical in the way she talked about it. No excess, just the work and the possibility of the work. And Marcus found that he spoke to her the same way, that the conversation was easy in a manner that surprised him a little. He told Earl at work in December. Not the details, just that he had a side thing going on, that he was teaching on weekends, that it was small, but it was growing. Earl looked at him across the facilities office desk and said, "Teaching what?" And Marcus told him, and Earl was quiet for a moment and then said, "Huh," which was Earl's version of being moved by something, and then he said, "How's Zoe?" And Marcus said she was good, and Earl said, "She knows she's the reason?" And Marcus said she did. Earl nodded and went back to his work, and Marcus went back to his, and the fluorescent light of the facilities office held them both in its ordinary way. And Marcus thought that maybe this was what it looked like when a life shifted, not like a door opening, but like a window you'd been standing in front of for a long time that you finally looked through. By March, he was running 3 sessions a month. The bookings were steady. Renee had been approached by a parenting non-profit that ran programs for single fathers through the community centre on Western Avenue. And they had asked whether Marcus would be willing to do a series of workshops there, 6 sessions, subsidised, so cost was not a barrier to the men who came. He said yes. the nonprofit put up a flyer. The first session drew 11 men. There was a moment in the fourth workshop on a rainy March Tuesday in the community centre's multi-purpose room when Marcus looked out at the men working around the practice stands, 9 of them that evening, all focus and tongue tips and careful hands, and at the children who had come with some of them, sitting along the wall with the solemn, engaged faces of children who understand something important is happening, and Zoe at the centre station demonstrating for Devon's daughter the way she liked her crown section split, explaining it with the authority of someone who had been doing this all her life, which, in a manner of speaking, she had, and Marcus understood something in that room that he could not have gotten to any other way. That the thing he had built in grief, in the absence of anyone telling him he could do it, in the kitchen of a small apartment with a spray bottle and a comb, and a daughter who needed him to show up, had always been more than hair. It had been proof. That the doing of a thing faithfully, daily, without credit, without an audience, was its own kind of knowledge. And that knowledge was transferable, that it could be carried from your hands into another man's hands, that it was worth something in the world beyond the kitchen where it was made. He did not say this to the room. He did not need to. The room was already saying it. A year after Renee's first call, she and Marcus had a waiting list. The workshops at the community centre had become a standing monthly programme. 2 other salons had reached out. A local paper had run a small piece on the programme, 12 column inches and a photograph of Marcus at the practice stand, Zoe beside him, both of them looking at the work rather than the camera, and the headline had called him something that he privately thought was too grand for what he actually did, which was show up and show what he knew, but Zoe had cut it out and taped it to the refrigerator without asking him. And there it was, between a school lunch menu and a library reminder which he thought was about the right level of importance. He still did her hair every morning. That had not changed and was not going to change, because it had never been only about the hair, and both of them knew it, and the morning ritual was its own particular thing. The 12 minutes in the kitchen with the oil warming and the tablet on the counter, the 2 of them in the piece of a thing they had done so many times it lived in the body, hers and his, a knowledge the hands carry that the mind does not have to labour over any more. She was 8 now, and she had opinions about the styles, which had always been true, and she had started asking him to try new things which he attempted with varying success, and which she evaluated with a candour he appreciated. There was a Tuesday in February when he had tried something new involving a middle part and a series of flat twists he had seen on a video, and it had gone badly sideways, and Zoe had looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment and then looked at him in the mirror and said, "Daddy, that one needs more practice," in the patient voice she used when she was being generous, and he had laughed, really laughed. The kind that starts in the chest and comes up clean, and she had laughed too, and they had fixed it together, her directing from the mirror, and by 6:55 they had something she was willing to walk into school with. That was the morning he thought about most. Not the newspaper, not the workshops, not the waiting list. That Tuesday morning in February, the 2 of them at the mirror, working the problem, her patient voice and his laughing, and the yellow bands on the counter, waiting to be useful. That was what it looked like, the thing he had built, not because anyone had handed it to him or because the world had finally noticed. Because one morning, 3 years ago, he had looked at his daughter and understood that this was his to do. And he had done it, and kept doing it. And the doing had made him someone he had not known he was going to be. Zoe brought the newspaper photo to school for show and tell in the spring. She told her class that her daddy had been doing her hair every day for 4 years and had taught other dads how to do it too. Her teacher sent Marcus a note that said the class had a lot of questions, mostly about technique. He wrote back that he would be happy to come in sometime if Mrs. Calloway thought it was appropriate. Mrs. Calloway wrote back in under an hour and said yes. The morning after he got that note, he did Zoe's hair at the kitchen table the way he always did. The oil warming, the tablet on the counter, her chosen show playing quietly. He worked the sections apart with the slow, sure patience of someone who had learned this the hard way and was no longer afraid of it. She was still enough, and the room was warm, and outside the window the April light was starting to come up over the rooftops of the block, and his hands knew what they were doing, and that was enough, and it had always been enough. The yellow bands were on the counter where they always were, waiting. He reached for them when he was done. She turned her head to see herself in the small mirror, propped against the fruit bowl, and whatever she saw, she was satisfied with it. She hopped down from the chair and picked up her backpack and looked at him with her mother's eyes and said, "Good job, Daddy." the way she said it every morning. And he said, "Thank you, baby," the way he always did. And the day started the same as every other day, which was the whole point, which had always been the whole point. Kindness is not always quiet. The kind that holds a person together, the kind that shows up every morning before the world asks it to, very often is. And the world, when it finally sees it, does not always know what to call it. The ones who needed it know. They always know.